Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the confines of my home and Todd's home. So today we're going to be talking to you. Todd is actually, I've been talking to him about this for a while, but we've been talking about some of the evidence-based management, the EBM implementations that Todd Miller has done in the field, and he has finally, I've finally gotten him on the Scrum Pulse to share this with us. So my name is Patricia Kong. I'm from Scrum.org. I'm sitting in my house near Boston, Massachusetts, and this is professional Scrum Trainer Todd Miller.
Hey, nice to see everybody. And I came on without kicking and screaming too much, right? Not too much.
I mean, it's been a year, Todd. So just quick guidelines for everyone. As you're getting logged in, your microphones are going to be muted, but please do ask questions. So today, the intent is, very quick overview for me about what evidence-based management is, what we've added in terms of our thinking to that. And then I think the real value here is for just me and Todd to have a conversation about some of the implementations that you've done in the field, Todd, and then take your questions and we'll go through those. So the questions, send those through. I'll be watching, and multitasking is not my forte, but I'm sure it'll work out.
I'll try to fill in the blanks if you pause. I'll just try to talk about something exciting. We should have come up with like some kind of like you like touch your nose when you're
touch
like some
your
kind
nose.
of seagull. People wouldn't notice.
So the introductory slide of who's Scrum.org. Scrum.org is an organization founded by Ken Schreiber, the co-creator of Scrum, and really focused on training, education, and certification. So here's all of our pretty courses, and here are all pretty badges, and those are really focused on, again, the classes that we have, and the certifications and assessments that we have, and those are all run by professional Scrum trainers like Todd, who have been through the gamut and are experts in all these different things. So Todd, would you care to introduce yourself? You look a little bit older than this picture.
In the picture or now? Is it it's the gray beard?
I am actually just not going to answer that to make you feel very uncomfortable, but I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, not too much more to say other than what's on this slide. I've been a professional Scrum trainer at Scrum.org for over 4 years now, if you can believe that.
I actually recruited you with Rich Hunthausen.
You did. I was at the Scale Professional Scrum class in November of 2015. Jeez. 2015.
You were asking very good questions, so we were like, oh, he knows. Got it.
Yeah, so that's about me. Other than that, that's I do all those things on that slide. Except I have a beard now and apparently look older.
And well, no, that's not what I said. You have a sunburn too. I noticed that. How did you before I even go into the thing, actually, let me do this. So today what we're going to be talking about, and there's tons of introductory webinars about evidence-based management from Scrum.org. There's the evidence-based management guide, similar to the Scrum guide, which explores our thinking. But this is a really quick notion of when we take evidence-based management, it's this notion of measuring and managing for holistic change in your organization. So we have broken down EBM into 4 key value areas. And if you're looking at the circle, current value, what are you currently doing? Unrealized value, what could you be doing? What's that benefit if you're looking at satisfaction gaps, right? So really looking at the market. And then from the capability of the organization to deliver on those, what's our time to market, what's our ability to innovate. So generally organizations are thinking in these 4 areas, but they're not always thinking about all of them together. So when we're thinking about solutioning, when we're thinking about our problems, this allows us to look for evidence in those areas and then think about how they relate to everything else. And what we started to add is this notion of, hey, That's great that you measure. Let's figure out how that actually relates to goals in your organization. How do we progress? You got to where you are now by doing something in the past. Let's recognize those things, but let's figure out what we want to do to try to progress forward, set next target states, those kind of things. But the message I'm going to drop here is that let's measure things, let's try to improve, but let's make sure that there's a goal behind that. And obviously, if you're going to try to move forward, we're talking about always experimenting, right? So you look at the experiment loop, what kind of hypotheses do you have? How would you measure that? And then your goal, when you're working toward that goal, it may be right and it may be wrong, So you'll figure those things out. Now that I've gotten through that, Todd, you and I have been jamming and talking about EBM for a while, and you always surprise me when you come back and you say, Patricia, I was trying all these things out and, it got me in trouble or not, but why did you start using evidence-based management with some of your clients? Because what we're able to do today, I think, is loosely share some of those experiences, but just why did you even try it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would admit I'm a recovering waterfall developer, and so I had this big thing when I was coming out of college where I really had this thing where I wanted to change the world, right? We all do. Graduate from college, you're all like stoked to change the world, and I got into software development and fell in love with the profession, and I just always wanted to know like how it was improving the way a customer was working or what it was doing for them, and or how they were using it, because oftentimes how you intend a customer to use it is different than how they actually use it, right? Mm-hmm. Is that a surprise? Yeah. And so for years though, I struggled with the fact that it was more about how fast I was doing something, right? And sometimes never even got to see the benefit of how a customer using it. And I remember one time that sticks out to me where I had been building something for 8 or 9 months with a team and got asked to go to a customer site to implement it, and the customer just completely rejected it. It was like a just-in-time inventory management system. Just completely, they were like, what did you do? And I just put 10 hours a day for 8 or 9 months into this, and it isn't at all what they wanted, right? So then when I found extreme programming and then Scrum, I got into consulting and noticed a lot of maybe the things that people said they were measuring, that the names of them had changed, but it was still
same stuff.
It was still the same stuff. It was still centered around like outputs, right? And so I quite frankly read the EBM guide I forget what paper it was originally. I think you had mentioned it to me because I'm just like struggling. I'm so tired of velocity. I'm so tired of saying it's not a weapon to use against your development teams, that there has to be some other framework or some other way. And I was experimenting on my own, and got into EBM, and it's yeah, I'm loving it.
It's funny.
That was a long story.
Well, no, it's just more like it's nice to hear where that that passion is coming from, right? Because it's usually like, it just sounds like you're constantly disappointed in and times hadn't changed, and then you were in an area, and I don't know if you're certainly doing this probably for the customer's benefit, but hopefully trying to change something, right? And that's why we're in this industry. I mean, that's certainly how my story is around Scrum and Agile. It's just constant disappointment and no more suppression. Like, let's have a real conversation. It's kind of where it goes. And so, I mean, you and I have talked about this, about how EBM, a lot of people are talking about metrics, but the intent of this is really around organizational change under the guise of measurement, because let's have that conversation there. Let me just put, what I'm going to do is, for the audience, I'm going to actually put up the takeaways for implementing EBM in the field. And and we'll go through each one of these, I think, through the different stories that we'll hear, and you'll go into all these different things. But let's start with something that's really tangible. So when we're having that conversation with management, and you go, hey, let's start measuring stuff. You told me a really good example of where you were like, they weren't listening to me until we started measuring stuff and then made some changes. And then lo and behold, we were saving them about $10,000 a month. Without giving too much on, the background of that in terms of, any NDAs you've signed.
Yeah.
So we don't want to send the Scrum Pulse to them. Do you want to share some of the problems? Like what'd you do? What'd you start measuring? What was that conversation? Who were you working with? How did you start to show that information back to that company?
Yeah, that was an interesting case because everybody was complaining about how much maintenance work for older versions was disrupting their current work to develop new things for the product. And you heard it in the halls, you heard it at lunches, you heard it everywhere, and you could feel it, right? So the thing is, when you address something because it's something like that, because it's emotional, people were tired, they feel interrupted constantly. It really didn't get me anywhere because I took it upon myself to approach an executive about how I felt like it was a big problem, and they were kind of, I don't want to say laughed at me, but just kind of put it off, right? And that's when I started to say, well, we have data to figure out something, right? There has to be data. And I think that's a key tip of advice for anybody listening here is there's data everywhere. You just have to know where to get it from and how to harness it and how to make it tell a story, not from your own story, but the data, like a real story, what's actually happening kind of story.
How do you do that though? Because I've been talking certainly to executives about metrics, and they'll go, or data, and they'll go, we have tons of data. All we have is data, and then like, how do you start to mine through that? Because what I found is that you have a lot of data, you're creating false stories for yourselves, false causal relationships, or like things that don't even make sense, and that still happens in society today in the grand scheme of things. But how do you help them figure out? How are you helping them figure out what mattered in terms of the right data?
Yeah, and that's where so in looking at EVM, I just started like evaluating the KVAs to see if there was something that would make sense to me, right? And
Get 4 shots.
yeah, right. And so we started going down the path of looking at installed version index, right? So if anybody doesn't know what's installed in version index, it just shows like across your customers what version they're using. And some of the portions of this application were in a quite heavily regulated environment. And what we really kind of came to found is it was really difficult to deploy the product, right? It was a really difficult thing to deploy the product. And on top of that, you have these really sophisticated auditing mechanisms that can kick in at any time that could shut a place down if they updated the product in an inappropriate, if there wasn't a log, that showed everything that had happened and they could sift. Auditors love logs of stuff. They like, yeah. So with the data, what I found is that I could find a couple of things. I could find what releases the customer was on, right? Which painted a picture of how many different versions the customer bases were on, different customer bases were on. And then I could figure out how much time was being spent because they had a system where the development team members would have to put billable hours in. And although their contracts would max out, say like you only have 10 billable hours of maintenance a month, but we had to still meet that, fulfill those customers' needs, they'd still track that. So their employees were still tracking their time against it. And so those two things, understanding how many different versions, and then understanding the further you went, there was a direct correlation between the further you went back in a version, the more hours a employee was spending on trying to mitigate issues that particular customer. It was crazy. It was like, I wish I still had the chart. I might, Probably can't bring it up though.
You can't show that.
So like there was an absolute direct correlation, and then I took that back to that executive, and I was like, I just spent a little bit of time because I didn't want to think I was going on some wish hunt, and I just want to show you these facts that I do really think we have a problem here. I think we should spend more time working on how we deploy this application, because there was a big argument against that. Right? That's not giving customers new value. Right? It's not giving customers new value working on how we deploy the application. And that really changed that conversation when they saw that, because it was detracting from the value because people were context switching. Customers on old versions weren't getting the benefit of the stuff in new versions. Right. So it really
How'd
changed.
you come up with the 10K number? Because now you're having that conversation. They're like, let's fix some stuff. And then at the end of it, you were like, hey, we helped you save $10,000 a year. How did you manage to calculate that?
Yeah, so that's interesting. It was 10,000 a month, and I think I'm actually lowballing that number. I think it might have been more. But what I did is I didn't have access to what people got paid, so I just figured out what the average cost of a developer was per hour in the area, and I took that by the number of hours in maintenance, and then we did a study and just kind of refreshed those reports as we had as we kind of built out this new kind of continuous delivery. It wasn't really continuous delivery because of how it was packaged, but these new packaging mechanisms that would appease audit and just make it easier for a customer to upgrade. And so I actually did some fuzzy math on that by looking at average developer salaries. So
who was your champion there? Like when you were talking, is this like CIO? Is this somebody who's in finance? Like, who are you having these conversations with?
This was basically the CEO of the company at this point. It was a smaller company. The developers were kind of the champions behind it because they really wanted to improve the deployment mechanisms because it was just causing them so much headaches.
Yeah, I think that's so. The reason that I'm asking that. And maybe it is because it's a smaller company, but when you, like, people get, like when we talk about, wow, look at what we're not doing. Like you brought up this notion of, you brought up value, right? So you brought up that, and not everybody's buying into that conversation depending on what they're responsible for in the organization. I would say, and I'm not saying that, I'm just acknowledging that, because what their responsibility is potentially, if you're like a CFO, is to get, or in the finance area, is to make sure that, we're fulfilling, or we're trying to look at a business case and we're fulfilling that, right? And so EBM makes sense to them, but there's a notion of value that gets lost, which is, when you're talking at to the CEO, we're thinking about end-to-end value, right? So we might not be making money, but there's a lot of value that, and a lot of learning that we're having. And in operations, potentially you're looking at efficacy. So we are interested in saving money. We are interested in saving time. We are interested in all those things. So that's just why I was asking who you were talking to.
Yeah, you just triggered a thought there. I think this really presents the case too, why EBM is, you need to concentrate on look at everything, right? Because so what if in this instance there was a really immense amount of high customer satisfaction and we were just looking at current value, and there was a lot of feature usage and things like that, but over time, the more people that were on the more versions, the slower the engine to get to market is. And so you could say, like you were saying, efficacy, right? So what happens to that over time if time to market goes down but current value is going up? Like that's why I think it's really important to have a holistic view of what you're looking at.
And the flip is true, right? So like you could have you could be releasing all the time, like you said, and your current value could be low because they're not really interested or using whatever you're producing. The innovation thing that you were talking about, the innovation rate, there was an experience that I had where, they were looking at the numbers and they said, yeah, we're innovating, we're cool in terms of this is how much we spend on innovating on, new versions, new ideas and all that stuff. But what I found was when we actually went and measured it, that there was a big and the conflict was between management and the teams. And what it was that management was budgeting money for innovation, but they weren't actually doing it because they were maintaining all the old versions of a product. So that's a really smart way to go through things, and you'll hear it. You'll hear it from the teams.
Yeah. You got me thinking deeply.
I know. I can see that. I can see the thinking stuff. There's an interesting. There was a question that came in, and I think this might relate to a story. So I'll line it up this way, right? So there's a question: does EBM work with any scaling framework? And certainly we do have case studies that are available on Scrum.org. Scaling frameworks or Scrum or anything, actually, I would say you could just try to start measuring wherever you are. Todd, I know that there was a customer we've talked about where you were implementing the Nexus framework, right? So the Nexus framework from Scrum.org is scaling professional Scrum. So how do multiple Scrum teams work together? So you got brought in to do scaling, and I think this one is an interesting story for us to share, because it's usually like, come in, coach and consultant, teach us how to do Agile. We're going to transform now. We're going to scale. And then, of course, you probably went in and shook it up a little bit, didn't you?
Yeah. It's interesting. So at scale, this was 4 development teams. So we're not talking, 100 or anything. We're talking 4 development teams, and they had been working on scaling for quite some time. Just were missing the mark on a lot of things. We're always late. It seemed like everything ended in with bug triaging meetings and things like that. So they brought me in to help them kind of look at process, and I was working to do that a little bit, but worked a little bit with the product owner and started just asking questions. I think this is more centered around the goals conversation, right? Which is part of EBM. That's why EBM is a framework. It's not just a path for metrics, but I started asking about, like, you've been operating this program for 2.5 years. What's the purpose of it? Like, what's our goal here? What's the goal in the end of
Well, how are the
this?
teams feeling? Were they like, I'm just interested because you're talking about a goal now. Were the teams like happy? Did they seem to be?
It was a weird vibe. Like, I don't know. At first, I feel like I felt like first like I felt like the enemy of everybody, but then they started warming up to me a little bit once they got to know me and how smooth I am, right?
Yeah.
But so I was kind of working behind the scenes in the goal conversation. From a process perspective, we were just trying to get them to adopt the Nexus framework and have like a common definition of done. That was a big problem. And a combined increment, right? Those were some of the challenges tactically from the development side. From the product ownership side, though, they were a fairly new product owner and had been brought into that situation from the outside. And so we started going in and trying to figure out what the original business case was for the application that we were building. And like I said, it was like 2.5, maybe 3 years in progress. This is millions of dollars, by the way. And we came to find that the original business case had said that a customer would receive something. A current state is 10 days, and that we will give it to the customer in 1 day by the end of this product development effort. And 2.5 to 3 years in, and many millions of dollars, they were at 9.7 days. 9.7 days.
Did they know that?
What's that?
Did they know?
I don't know how. I think that everybody just forgot about it. They were just like, they just kept passing budget to put more on it. And then the talk was to add another team too, another development team, maybe a 5th development team to this whole effort, because they weren't moving fast enough. But once we recentered on that goal, and the product owner did a great job of inciting the masses in that, and brought that to the sprint review and said, hey, this is our original goal. We're not near that. I'm going to steer this entire ship to us meeting that goal, because it's still a relevant goal for us to achieve. And yeah, so that ended up getting me yelled at a little bit.
By the product owner? Or?
No, by their boss, because because I was kind of tampering in areas that were very sensitive to executive management, right? They had proved the business case and had made this promise and spent a lot of money, and somehow along the lines, everybody forgot what the initial intent was. And so that's a case of me maybe, I don't know if you've asked me before if I would change anything about my approach to that. I don't think I would. I think that it was the right thing to do. Maybe I would have slow crawled it and recommended that the product owner didn't bring that into the sprint review where all the stakeholders were there, and it made a couple executives feel embarrassed. Maybe.
Well, did you get kicked out of the engagement quickly, or?
Not quickly. It was a slow kick out.
Well, there's a lot to unravel here, Todd, right? So you're saying I was helping a product owner, they brought me in, they were scaling Agile transformation. It sounds like you were helping them think about the vision and the why, right? So we're looking at all these things, but we don't know why we're doing stuff. Now you're saying that why, empowered your product owner, but got you in trouble because of another conversation. And so now you're having a lot of conversations about transparency. So you didn't get kicked out. And I think what we talked about was that, whether you did it that way or differently, I don't know if the end result would be different, but do you think that a certain environment has to exist then for us to be able to have these conversations? Or, I mean, your tactic is, your style is always like, here I am, like, let's actually do stuff and improve. But do you think that something else has to exist for people to do EBM or even Scrum?
This might be this might be the kind of the conversation around how executives need to be willing to change as well, right? And because so many times I've seen, and we've talked about how change is fine for the development teams, right? But then when you start kind of hitting on these buttons and talking about the why and trying to trace, like, was the spend worth it? Did we spend money on something that was worth it or not? Often those people that hold those budgets have earned their way there, right? They have a lot of political clout in an organization. And when you try to change things that they've maybe been doing for 20 or 25 years, and you start asking questions in a different way that is concerned more about outcomes that hold them accountable, maybe it's accountable. Yeah, generally they're accountable for it in an organization. I think accountable is the right word in that circumstance. You start kind of pushing buttons, I think, when you do that. So I think maybe it would be worth getting them to understand why Agile in the first place. Right? I joke about it, but it's true. When I started using Scrum, it didn't make me faster at typing, right? And the promise isn't to increase your output, right? The promise is to try to hit outcomes for customers that are better, right? So, did I answer the question, or am I just rambling now?
I mean, you're talking. No, you did answer the question. I mean, you're talking about, like, getting more involvement, and I think that's why, for us, when we're going to be releasing an updated version of the EBM guide, it's why the goal is so important, and it's to be able to have that conversation of what you're actually focused on. I'm not going to even say and aligned on, not even in terms of what you're spending money on, but where you're investing your money. And there's a lot of times where we need to be accountable if we had a pet project and we've just been investing there, because you may have gotten yelled at, but that's because that person may not want to get yelled at. And there's this whole conversation we can have around ego and status and all that stuff within an organization. But that's what Agile will do. It's not going to tell you what's the right product to build. Scrum's not going to make you type faster. It's all these other things you have to put in an effort with. So you're talking about output and outcomes, and I know that you really want people to understand that. So one of your takeaways too. So look at that, we're hitting these bullet points by coincidence. So EBM, like Scrum, it's easy to understand but hard to implement. Start small and experiment, right? So you're going to try it a lot of different times. I'm assuming you're going to, you come in at different conversations. It's not so process oriented where it's step one, do this, but you're going to have to find a way in, right? But you're talking now about don't get married to easy to find metrics. And I think you're talking about output versus outcomes here. And there was a question that that came in that was like, how does this compare to measurements when we're talking about Kanban or CMMI? Can you hit all of that? I'll help you.
Yeah, so I mean, I can talk a little bit to like some of the measurements in Kanban, but however, it's really based off of the Kanban system that's been implemented, right? So for my definition of it is, I mean, we can talk about some things like cycle time, work item age, and throughput, and those are really oftentimes specific to delivery. But if your Kanban board is released to the customer and also has in its workflow validated, that's a whole different story. So I think it would be too much for this webinar to go down the path of talking about how those things interoperate with each other. I would say that hopefully if you're using Kanban style metrics, you're going to get the benefits in particular key value areas from that, because we do want to look at internally at the system to see if there's any improvements that could be made, but those should be left to the Scrum team's devices, right? We don't want to bring a hammer, management shouldn't bring a hammer down on those kind of things. So I'm stuttering now because I all these scenarios in my mind about the definition of a team's workflow are happening. And so for ones that's to do, doing, and done, what's done mean, right? Ideally though, there is a validation step where you're going back and seeing what happened with the customer's interaction with that feature or whatever you're putting in production is, because we've talked about this many times. Everything until a customer gets it is a hypothesis. We don't know.
For me, like when people throw that stuff out, I start to say, well, how do you define Agile, right? And it's, for me, very basically, we could talk about done feedback and your ability to adapt. Can you do those things? So you might be looking at output metrics, and those might be great in terms of understanding your capability. But again, that holistic view of did this bring value? How are the teams doing? Is this worth us continuing? Those are things that we can look at together. But come back to outputs versus outcomes, because there's metrics and other methods, other processes, sure, right? But there's this notion of we are gold on outputs. And actually, there was a recent report that came out. I don't know if you know this, Todd, but it said that people are not the success is not based off of velocity as much as now they're looking at value, determined business value, which is really interesting because I still am marred in those other conversations. And I would ask you, what are you guys actually defining as value when you think about that, right? But what is the difference for you between the outputs and outcomes? And give an example of an outcome.
Yeah. So one thing I'll just ask everybody to think about really quick is it possible that your team's velocity could be increasing and you have unsatisfied customers? Right. Velocity, I don't even want to go down that path. It's just an arbitrary metric you can use, that Scrum teams can use. But I think that's where we start to get into the situation where outputs are easy to find. They're built into the way that our organizations are structured today. So like an output as in like we produced something, right? We produced a feature, we shipped a feature. Outcome, to use maybe a couple examples of it, maybe an outcome that your organization's trying today, if you're a retail store or something like that, is that we want to increase our customer satisfaction by 5% or something like that. What's been really interesting as I've gone down this path the past few weeks specifically, I've heard from so many people, but we don't have we're not equipped to get that data anywhere, to get the outcome data. It's just easy for us to find outputs. It's easy for us to measure cycle time of a product backlog item, and even measure cycle time until it's in production. But we have zero way of validating it. We don't have that tooling. We don't have that data. That's been really surprising. I've heard that from a couple people over the past few weeks doing user group talks. But outcome is like something as it relates to how your customer is perceiving the application. I guess I'm what your customer gets from it, right? And output is what was the speed of us building it. Does that make sense?
That's kind of like the leads into our third story you're going to share, where you were helping this company and they were using Scrum, and then I think what happens is naturally you're using something and somebody says, right, what do we measure? And the real question is, are we getting better, right? So usually that question is, what are we measuring here? It's, are we getting better? Is this worth it? So I know that when you were talking with this group, you guys were looking at, originally some metrics that you could get for the easy win, right? So a lot of like the on product and like those kind of things that were down in the bottom 2 KVAs. But then you said, I remember the story you told me, when we started to talk about the market value, there was a complete shift in how you guys had to think about that. You want to share that one?
Yeah. So this was a retail company, and we did get easy wins with metrics because, so truth be told, I was working as a coach on a transformation at this particular place, and I had done quite a few Scrum trainings, and that, we started talking about, they were like, how do we know if we're being successful or not? Is this working? And the quick wins were in the bottom 2 KVAs, as you mentioned. And then I'll distinctly say, I don't remember what role they were playing in the organization, but I remember a person saying to me, but all of our employees love it here, and our customers are completely elated with what we're doing. And I said something along the lines of, probably not so smoothly, maybe, let's prove it. Let's figure that out. Let's prove it. Are you saying that because you have data, or do you like, no, I know it. Like, look at everybody's happy, right? And so those were the 2 things when we started.
We're getting paid. We have jobs.
Yeah. Yeah. I just came back from my hour-and-a-half lunch, and I'm leaving in like another hour. So one of the things we decided to do was to start to measure employee satisfaction, to try to figure that out. We also started to try to dig around how we could understand customer satisfaction, and they had a call center. So we started kind of seeing what data we could mine from a call center, and then just quite frankly, building mechanisms into the tool for that, just to explore it. And they were quite happy to spend budget on it, which was great, right? Again, this was a circumstance where, like, customer satisfaction, how do we get that? We're not equipped. We don't know how to measure that. So they started having to put some things in their tool. And I'll never forget when we did the first employee satisfaction survey, specifically on that, and people were, it was quite low. And it was almost like a big insult, right? How could, I don't understand how people can be unhappy. Look what we've done. We spent so much money on training. And it was just things like, you're asking us to do this, but my team and I are spread all around the building. I can't talk to anybody. Like, I have to walk across everything, is all these things. And you start seeing a pattern of these things happening. And they actually turned and started spending budget around revamping the office space for it to be more optimal towards them using Scrum now, right? Like, I guess they hadn't considered that it was very difficult to walk the whole way across the building to talk to like somebody else on their team. And as they kind of evolved and started to make changes, they started seeing it go up. I don't remember where we land with customer satisfaction. We started measuring it. I would have to probably check back with them to see where they're at with it now, if they're still measuring it. But I know it was a bit lower than what they expected as well, which was eye-opening, right?
Yeah. And that's what it's really like. You can start to measure these small things, and then you have some different experiences coming out. When I think about outcomes like you were talking about from the customer point of view, it's really thinking about what does your customer want from this product, and are we doing that? Are we able to do that? Are we looking at if they're, satisfied with those type of things? There's a question here, Todd, that I'm going to lob at you. It's easy for you. What do you mean by start small regarding EBM and like Scrum? What were some of the first steps that you take, or what's a simple first step that you might take? I think that's a good one for us to share.
Yeah, I think that if you try to go all in and have your KVAs perfectly mapped out with KVMs, it'll take you a long time to actually get started, right? You'll be
KPMs
actually
meaning key value
key
metric.
value metrics. Yeah, I think that you'll accidentally be implementing EBM using waterfall. But I think this was an example of a case where I wanted to slow step it, right? And so we started with ability to innovate and time to market, because those were easy to find, and things that were there that we had data on, knowing full well though that wasn't a holistic view of what was happening. So we just picked a key value metric in each one underneath one of those KVAs, and started from there, and knowing that it needed to build out over time. But I just like to start quickly. I don't like to waste any time. I just like to start and go. As you know, sometimes that's good for me, sometimes that's not.
It's not like you're, hey, we're going to do EBM now, right? Like it's not even, it can be even probably more subtle than Scrum. So there's no roles, there's no events, there's no artifacts and those things. But if I was reviewing measurements, and there's a question about this there, there's the sprint review is, if you're using Scrum, an opportune time to start to share that stuff. But I know that other ways that generally you can start easily too, without looking for all this buy-in and all this stuff, is just looking at employee satisfaction, right? A retrospective, get some really fast feedback about that. Not waiting for some sort of annual review, but just saying like, how we doing, right? And then you're going to find reasons why. You can probably map those into KVAs, and then you can start to look at it that way. But remember, that's only half of it, because if you're not aligning those things back to goals, that's not going to be, you want to see that impact at the enterprise level. And you're going to have that conversation around goals in terms of what, right? And that's kind of why those 3 stories you're talking about, when it was like, we started measuring and we found some stuff and saved some money. Oh, we started measuring and then figured out we didn't have any goals. And we started measuring, and then we started measuring more and looking at this holistically of how we could actually manage at the enterprise level. It's those kind of layers that you're trying to peel back.
It's interesting because, I mean, you could really invert that too, right? Like you could start by asking about goals.
I would, depending on who I was talking to.
Yeah,
If I was talking to you 10 years ago, though, when I asked you about goals, you'd probably like run away.
Probably. Yeah. So you could really, I think it, like you said, it really depends on who you're talking to. It maybe depends on your role in the organization and what you have access to as far as data. I think goals would be a great way to start. And as you were kind of describing, there was times where I use this as a way to figure out where to go, right? It led me to the goal question, right?
As a consultant, right? Like you're putting your skin in the game to do that.
Yeah.
How have you been able to, so that third point that we're showing here is dig deep, make the effort to search for outcomes. And you were talking about it, but what, are there any like techniques? Are there any tools? And, we certainly have a lot of different practices, but is there anything specifically that you would be able to suggest to the audience?
I think that when I read this statement, one of the things I think about the most is sometimes you need to enlighten people on the why behind this. Why are we heading in this direction? Why are we trying to focus on something that's a little bit harder to capture, or maybe harder to define? Maybe not capture. Maybe don't even have the ability to capture it. Maybe you need budget to put the ability to measure outcomes in place. So I think it really starts with explaining why, and you do have to dig deep, because oftentimes it's not an easy conversation. It can be a difficult conversation, and people can be asking you why you're asking those questions. I've worked my way up in this organization, and I don't need you asking me questions about why I'm spending my budget the way that I'm spending it. So I think that it does take and I'm not saying you should, maybe my approach isn't the right, shooting from the hip and just going forward isn't the right way. I don't know, there's a lot of different ways you can tackle it. I've gotten smoother over time.
You have.
Not as direct, but I think that's what you really can't give up, because isn't this what agility is all about?
Yeah, and it's kind of if you're when there's things that look odd, right? And we do this, from a consulting or coaching point of view. But what Agile does, what Scrum does, what any of this does, what EBM is about is taking that you're doing these things in an enterprise. Let's look at it, right? I'm doing this. This means I have a flashlight in my hand. I'm looking at something, and then let's actually change that. So, somebody here was, and I agree with this. Somebody was saying it's that in their experience, it's how the bosses are compensated that drives what is important loosely. And I absolutely agree with that, because now we're talking about not only how bosses or how people, maybe they're not even bosses, got where they are, but what they care about. And that can actually, obviously, measurement drives behavior. Behavior will drive the environment, and that's all circular. And that's why this notion of thinking about the goals, so measuring is only as useful as what you do with it, is important. I mean, that's like, you can drive that back to anything, right? You can measure how much you weigh, and depending on what your goal is for your body, or for your health, or what you want to do, that's supposed to be information to inform you to do something. It's not a place to feel shameful. It's just, this something happened, went up, went down. That's great. That's not great. But what are all these other things? There's an interesting question in here, and I'm not sure I totally understand it. But it's around context switching and money saved from context switching. Would you say that you save money from context switching is a true statement or a false statement, or what do we have to think about?
I think it's a true statement. I mean, if you look at like the scientific evidence that's coming out about how bad it is for us to context switch, I say that, and I'm looking at one monitor, and I've got like stuff coming up. I've minimized everything, and I still see like alerts, and it's distracting, right? So you put that in some of the environments where I've been in, where the topic of resource utilization comes up, and it's all about maximizing how busy people are. I've seen it where you have like developers allocated 7% to this product, 33% to this one, but 60% of their time is on this one. It's having been a developer in the past, that is just such a significant reduction in our ability to develop with quality and our ability to get stuff done. And I think there's a lot of supporting evidence that's coming out now about how context switching it's not only counterproductive to being productive, but counterproductive to us as human beings. I actually heard that you have a 40% greater chance of getting into a car accident if you're listening to Audible.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't listen to Audible when I drive, because I was nervous that I'd like drift off and fall asleep.
Yeah, I joke around that I heard that on an Audible book while I was driving.
You jerk.
Joke. But it's real. Do you ever like listen to a book or a podcast, and then you have like an hour drive, and you're just like, how did I get here? Right? It's because your mind is creatively working to visualize what other people are, someone's reading to you. So
I only listen to those things when I used to be traveling, and I don't do that anymore. So when I'm walking the dog.
I know my Audible credits are stacked right now.
But the thing about like goal, compensation and all those things is super interesting, because it's saying, hey, you're a tester, you're compensated for how many bugs you find. Guess what I'm going to do now, So it's not necessarily a great way for us to lead. Let's think about it that way. This hasn't really come up, but it always comes up. How have you visualized these kind of things? Is there a tool that you like to use, or not? What does this look like for you? Because you've used EBM at many companies.
I wish I had like the greatest answer on the planet for this, but Excel, right? Because I can like, I don't know. I did work with somebody that was doing and measuring some of these things, and they were using Power BI pretty successfully. I'm not I'm more like I use a tool for the sake of creating transparency around something, right? I don't really get married to much as long as we can update it fairly quickly. And it's like, let's use the total cost of ownership of updating it and revitalizing it isn't very expensive. Uh, but predominantly just getting data and getting it into Excel and
Yeah. I think that's the first step, but then people say, how do you share that? How does that scale? What do you do to make that? Then I think the question then becomes, how much information are you actually trying to share? What's the value of sharing all your data that you've been showing, whereas putting it something lightweight, um, that makes sense. And I'm not talking about necessarily even just driving up everything into a memo report or all these things that certainly from if you're in the field, you're like, we've been measuring this, we're looking at this, here's some suggestions that you could move forward. But those things can come from the teams, right? If we're measuring those different things and having that conversation about value, we can have that conversation.
There's an interesting point in there because you mentioned sprint review as a supreme opportunity, and I couldn't agree more. But what if you're not using Scrum? I think that this calls for, EVM is an empirical framework, right? So you have to determine what opportunities you have and how you create it transparent, how you make it well understood, and when do you inspect and adapt it? Because if you just give somebody some charts, they may not make sense, right? It might not make sense what they're looking at, so they'll go to Google and make their own interpretation, and that could be dangerous, right? So I feel like there has to be opportunities where you're leveraging empiricism and you're inspecting what's happening with EVM in different intervals and your ability to change it, right? Just because you have one key value metric now doesn't mean that it's going to be anywhere near useful as you discover new things.
Right, and outcomes may change, right? So
Yep.
again, like that, looking at it's not even just changing from outputs to outcomes. It's going, why are we doing this? What is the value of doing this? And then you can have obviously a conversation about leading and lagging metrics, but
Yeah.
those different things, those things will change. So there are a few questions in here, and I thank you everybody for your questions, and we're nearing the end. I'm gonna give you two more questions. Okay?
We're going to make them easy ones.
Sure. What's your estimation of how much time is needed to implement a light basic kit of Agile metric? So how long would it take you just to get started in this notion of using Agile measurement?
Oh, I don't know that I can quantify it and say like 1.5 hours or anything like that. I think the big challenge is where you get the data from, availability of the data, and picking where to start. I don't envision it being something that takes you months to do. I would be surprised if it was if days were a thing, right? I think that you can get started right now. You can get started immediately, and I bet you in an hour you could probably have made some progress with evidence-based management, but it's never going to be perfect. You need to continue to inspect and adapt and make it transparent so you know what to inspect and adapt upon. And I mean, it could be as simple as finding one key value metric that makes sense in the context of your current circumstance, and then just starting to build out the key value areas from there. So the sooner the better, and the quicker the better, right?
If it's taking you a long time to do, you have to ask yourself why, right? And so those are different conversations too, I think. But it's exactly like if you looked at those key value areas, it's because people usually are saying we have a problem in one of those areas, or we want to get better in one of those areas. What is it? And then you can say, okay, well, let's take a look and see how it affects the other areas. So there's things like that. All right, last question. How can you overcome resistance or lack of understanding in management? For example, we don't need that, whatever that is, because project managers know what's best for their project. If they do not deliver, we just defund them. That's how we do it here. That's how a lot of places do it.
That's how we do it here. We've been in business for 100 years.
Right? Yeah. It's like, well, let's see if you're in the business the next 100 years. I mean, it's kind of close to what we're talking about restaurants, right? And how they're trying to operate in the time of COVID. How things have to change.
And I think that was a really interesting conversation. We talked about you and I talked about restaurants for like an hour. and how they're adapting and what they might measure and seeing how they're being successful. I think we talked about the incident that I had down here at Red Lobster. We'll talk about that here. There was something ridiculous that happened at Red Lobster where I lived, but I think I've made the mistake, I think, of being too direct about it right away, right?
Yeah. If someone says we don't need EBM and reject it, you're saying you don't need to come in and say you need to do EBM.
Yeah. I've made that mistake because I tend to be overly data driven and direct, and not everybody appreciates that. Maybe it's as simple as like just kind of sneaking it in a bit and showing it something different a little bit in a sprint review, right? And then I feel like if you come in and say thou shalt, that's when you get a lot of people that back off or become scared of it. But I think it's just as in adopting anything new, such as Scrum, right? It's the approach that you take to it, and I've found it immensely helpful describing the why behind it, right? Be well equipped to say why you're doing something, and start small. Don't just say, hey, look, I did this EBM dashboard with we have all 4 KVAs with 12 metrics underneath each one, right?
Yeah, there's I think it makes me think it makes me think about your first example, right? So it's kind of okay, if the project doesn't work, we just defund them, and so it goes to fund them and put that money where, right? So there's a conversation that you can have here larger around portfolio management, all these other things, and we're developing materials around that too, but it's very oriented around the goal, and it's kind of saying if you're working on, we're working on what traditionally works, and that's working for you, that's great. But if you're trying to say we're working on what traditionally works, but we want to call that agile, well, then when somebody comes back and says it's agile working, what are you going to show, right? So you have nothing to show to say, are we actually getting better? And what you will probably show is that you'll probably show all those output metrics. You will probably show velocity. You will probably show projects completed on time and all those. And I have a talk, it's out there everywhere, about why on time, on budget, on scope doesn't work and what does, right? So it's about thinking about why do those 3 things lock you into something that's antithetical to value. So there's this different way of thinking if you're trying to become a more effective organization and partner. With that said, now Todd, we have reached the end of our time box together, and there are a lot of there's still a lot of great questions here. I think everybody do that. Do you have any last words in terms of just messaging of what you want to share? I know there's your takeaways here, but just is there anything that we didn't hit?
No, I would say that that this is absolutely worth experimenting with. And evidence-based management, to me, is something that can cause an immense amount of change. It shines a flashlight sometimes on things that are ugly, that maybe nobody ever talks about, but everybody knows. And I encourage everybody to get started with it and give it a whirl.
Give it a whirl, yeah. And a lot of the times we'll find that organizations that don't want to give it a whirl in data, it's because there's a little bit more psychology in there about what that fear is about. Anyway,
they might be scared to see what it says, right?
Or that it can be used to abuse, so something like that. Yeah. So thank you everyone again. There's a lot of information on Scrum.org in terms of learning paths, trying to learn more. There's a lot of leadership questions that are coming up. We encourage you to take a look at some information there. We are developing a workshop that is virtual right now. So it's virtual and also can be in person, but I want you to know that that's coming up. We're going to be releasing the evidence-based management guide with continuous improvement stuff, and also we're doing a lot of work on portfolio. So we're spread a little thin also, but there's new stuff coming up here. Keep in touch, contact Todd. I don't know, how can people contact you, Todd?
All over the place. I'm usually readily available on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn, okay. Yeah. So LinkedIn, and then also through the Scrum.org website, probably.
Yeah, through the Scrum.org website. Look me up on there. Todd Miller. It's a pretty easy name. Not a fancy last name. I would want something.
You're American in America. We're a global community here. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Todd.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.